Glember, The Tale of a Monster. Written, recorded, and illustrated by A.K. Brookman. Chapter 20. The Temple of the Eight Walls. Continued. Day 58. I awoke somewhere along that path. Glember lay beside me, somehow alive. I was beginning to doubt he could die. What had happened? I remember beginning the trek up the winding passage toward the temple. I remember the effort of it. I remember the winds as they picked up and assailed my passage. Yet I could remember no more. What had stricken me to the earth? I felt about my head and body. I was able to move my limbs without difficulty. Although most of me ached in pain, I was not hurt so much that I could not stand. Had I fallen with exhaustion? Had I stumbled or misplaced a foot? I had the strange sensation I had made it further along the path than I now was. I stretched my limbs and took in a deep breath. It was the 58th day, I realized. Was I not to make it until the 60th, as Glember had planned? The idea was nonsense. I was tired. I had eaten little more than wild gourds and water over the past few days. I was growing weak, tired. I fell with exhaustion, I decided. I managed to lift Glember once again, although my muscles protested in pain. I took another deep breath and began once again to make my way. The winds picked up. I knew they would. I could see the way the mountains were carved. It was a simple rule of the terrain. There was no outlet for the winds around the mountainside save through this pass. I would have to push my way through. I quickly came to a standstill. I pushed with all my might and could fight no further. My legs slid back even when I did manage to gain a trivial amount of ground. I placed Glember on the ground and began dragging him over the gravel little by little below the brunt of the wind. Suddenly, he would go no further. I tugged and tugged to no avail. Ultimately, finding his tattered clothing had become caught on a protrusion of rock, I freed it and began again. Clouds began to roll through the mountains, and in little time it began to rain. At first I welcomed it, for I had become hot for the labor of dragging Glember up that steep path. But then we reached the polished stones of the wind-taken rock, and I began losing my grip. My hands and feet slid free time and time again as I attempted to make my way. I suddenly stopped pulling him along. "What is happening?" I asked aloud. The winds took my words with little remorse. It was as though the gods themselves were denying me passage, and yet I never asked for it. I was fulfilling my word to Glember, the last gargle. I suddenly felt very angry indeed. I was tired of this. I screamed out in the mountain air until it seemed the entire canyon shook with the force of it. I reached down and lifted Glember up once more. I screamed and threw myself against the winds and the rock. My feet began to slide, and I still pushed on, dropping my heels as quickly as the next one slid. I pushed until the winds gave up. I stepped until the stones could no longer end my advance. I plowed through and made my way with irrevocable conviction, with incorruptible determination. I knew not what forces were at work against me, but I'd not relent, nor would they deny me. Lest they take my life, I would reach the temple. And so I did. With the last of my strength, I kicked the door inward and stepped into the temple. Dizziness overcame me. I managed to lay Glember on the ground of the temple entrance hall before I fell with exhaustion once again. Day 59. I awoke late in the evening on that 59th day. Glember had somehow managed to drag himself further into the temple. I could see him in the distance, leaning against an old stone chair in the main temple hall. I was not surprised he had not pulled himself up into it. Indeed, I was still amazed to see that he lived, considering his wounds. I stood slowly, using the entrance hall wall for support. The inner sanctum rose high, and I was eager to enter and see what the fuss had been about. Nonetheless, a chill ran up my spine. I considered leaving. I had fulfilled my obligation to Glember, if it was indeed that. Still, I was curious. I decided I would step inside. I didn't think I could face the winds outside quite yet anyway. My footfalls echoed as I approached Glember, who was situated close to the center of the room. He was staring off in thought, and appeared somewhat restored in comparison with his state the day before. I gazed about the chamber, allowing him time to himself, And now I understood why he wanted to come here. Gazing about, I understood too the origin of the temple's name, for although its outer walls were smooth and rounded, the sanctum lifted from the solid stone floor by way of 8 walls, each depicting a beautiful scene. The 8 walls, I say, these were murals, each with a different view. My eyes were drawn to several. I'd been to these places. "Glember," I said, approaching one, "we've been here." I stared at the relief, recognizing the place as sure as I were staring down at my own hands, yet I could not place it. "Where was this?" I asked, pointing at the beautiful valley. Mountains lifted in the background, and limbs hung low in the foreground, as though the landscape were presented from beneath the shade cover of a tree. "You were there, human," Glember said after he turned toward it. "Under that very tree," he added. And then I remembered. "Ah, I recall now," I mused, staring intently over the lines and colors. "But the trees, Glember, all those beautiful little trees planted with such care." I turned toward Glember. "The trees are not in this scene." Glember was motionless, staring off. "It was an orchard, wasn't it?" I asked him with a smile. Glember seemed suddenly returned to his fatigued and near-death state. "No," he answered. "No, human." He turned his head down, now in resignation, in sorrow. I didn't understand. "It wasn't a farm, Glember?" I asked. I looked back to the scene, to that one of the 8 walls I'd been inspecting. I could still see the young trees, so many of them. "We plant them when a gargoyle dies," Glember said. It came out as little more than a whisper, the way a man speaks knowing his voice will crack beneath the emotion, but knowing he must say it. There was a moment of silence during which neither of us spoke, nor even moved. "But no one will plant them any longer, human," Glember said. "There is no one left to plant them." He swallowed. "And none left to bury." His head hung, and he said no more. "I'm so sorry, Glember," I said. "All those trees," I repeated. I shouldn't have said it. Yet I was caught in that moment. Our minds often refuse to piece words and thoughts rationally or with care under such circumstances, but race ahead of our hearts. "I'm sorry," I said again. "Heavens and underworlds, Glember, I'm sorry." Glember nodded, acknowledging my words, but he said no more. I sat beside him in silence for some time, not knowing what else to say. I leave that moment now, yet I will never leave it. I recognized many of the scenes splayed across each of the 8 walls. My eyes settled upon one in particular. A giant hand rose high mid-court in a village on this wall. 2 of the fingers were bent inward, as though in symbol. I studied it for some time, and finally I broke the dreadful silence. "We've been there too, haven't we, Glember?" He nodded. I stood slowly and approached the 8th wall. I reached out and ran my fingers over the stone upon which it was painted, over the 2 fingers bent inward. I stared long and intently at it, over its cottages and lanes, and ultimately back to the 5-fingered hand raising in its court in gesture. "What does this mean, Glember?" I asked. I bent the same 2 fingers of my own hand inward, mimicking the gesture painted before me. Glember's next breath was deeper, though not complete. He let it free. "Love," he answered. "Peace," he added. I nodded. "What happened to the 2 fingers bent inward on the statue in the court of the village we passed?" I asked him. "For surely this is that very place," I mused aloud. Glember looked to me now, found my eyes. "The Nye Wizard Order broke them off, and buried them just outside the village," he answered. My mind was racing, searching. I looked down to the newly healed gash on my leg. Glember nodded. "It was the same," he answered, knowing my realization. I had cut my leg on one of the half-buried fingers broken from the great statue of peace desecrated by the wizards of Nye. Yet the scar of their crimes was much greater, a wound over existence. "Why did they do it?" I asked. "So others would think gargoyles destroyed the city?" I answered for him, guessing. "No, human," he answered. "That was a gargoyle city, destroyed by the Nye wizards, its inhabitants slain to the last child, just as the Nye Wizard Order has long done from the shadows." Glember took in a deep breath and let it loose into the temple of the 8 walls. "Why would a gargoyle village have as its centerpiece a human hand bent in gesture of love?" I asked the gargoyle. He looked at me. "You still don't understand, do you?" he asked. I'm trying to, Glember, I answered. Help me to. Glember nodded, lifting his hands. Let me show you then, he said, removing his tattered gloves. He held his hands out for me once again in the soft light of the Temple of the Eight Walls, and I saw the scars. I looked from his hands to his eyes, back to his hands again, disbelieving. 2 fingers had been severed from each hand at the base. I blinked and shook my head. Glember tilted his head slightly, studying me. It was true, though. I could deny it no more. His hands were my own. Damn it, I said. Damn it, Glember. I paced to and fro with my hands over my head. I stopped pacing and looked to him. How could I not notice? I asked. How? I was shaking my head as I spoke. Men only believe what they are told to believe, Glember answered. They fear what they are told to fear, and hate what they are told to hate. I sat down where I had been standing. I wanted to argue otherwise, but I could not. How could I? I remembered the red claw drawn by my brother on the wall of Rockshade Cave as a child. I remembered my brother retelling the horrors he'd heard as well. I remembered running my fingers over the figure he scrawled in red rock. Even then, without reason or thought, I gave in to the fear, the lie, and my hate for the gargle had begun. The Nye Wizard Order, using fear, had taken a symbol of love and peace, ripped it apart, and made it to appear the opposite, and they used this tactic to exterminate the gargle. They return there each year, Glember explained. The Nye Wizards, he went on. They bring young men, unwittingly foolish young men who join the guard thinking they are doing good, fighting for what is right. They sit around the statue, and each of a few wizards tells a story of some savage encounter with a gargle, and how vile and evil the gargle is. The young men listen. They jump in fear at noises in the distance. They take these tales home and relay them. They even take turns urinating on the Statue of Peace, and when the time came, they would murder the gargle with an unjust barbaric pride. They murder in ignorance, return home in ignorance, and Glember finished, are held as heroes in ignorance. There are words that echo, no longer in air, nor from walls, nor even lips, but echo the same. There are words that bleed, words that awaken, that instill. There are words that companion a man. Many of these were Glember's words. I've heard his words echo at companions, and they've willed me through an inflection. I've learned that the lies we are fed in the past often pave a dangerous road for disbelieving the truth as it unfolds around us, so much so that we are often completely blind to it. I wonder that a steadfast disbelief in everything we are told is not the only path to truth and knowledge, that only what we learn and experience for ourselves can be true if we are to truly wake to awareness. After all, if we fall for any base lie, are we not prey to fall for another? Are we not prey then to fall for all of them? Not if we disbelieve them all. If we choose to know, to accept only what we learn ourselves, are we not our own? Are our minds not free, and otherwise only corrupted? Yes, I answer. I mentioned earlier that I remembered what happened the night Glember found me. I originally assumed Glember had attacked me that night. The snarling, the gashes I received from fangs and claws. I awoke in that cave to find Glember standing at its mouth. The truth was, I never saw anything that previous night. I was attacked, true. It was raining and dark, and I'd gotten mud in my eyes in the struggle. But looking back, remember the growling, the snorting, the fur. I know it was a rising wolf and not Glember, as I originally presumed. Remembering this now, I turned toward Glember. I would have walked down here willingly with you, had I known the person you were, Glember, I said. You never would have had to pretend you beat me senseless that night instead of the rising wolf. Glember smiled. You remember, he said, and I nodded. But I woke in that cave with you guarding the exit, I began. I didn't know you were guarding it then. I thought you were blocking it. You did, Glember agreed, and I guarded it all night. I did never sleep that night, but guarded it all the night. I remained silent a moment, falling into sitting position, blinking in recollection. You were attacked by a rising wolf, Randall. I happened to be passing by at that very moment. I heard your cries. I saved your life, and yet You had bled much. Your family would not have been able to protect you if it came back, and they always come back. It would have beaten through your walls and doors as though they were made of leaves. I took you to that cave and guarded you. The creature drew near several times that night, but it did not wish confrontation with me again. Glember went on. Forgive me. I thought my saving you would be enough, but the terror you cast me during those short periods when you woke and fell away again several times throughout that first night, I knew you would never be grateful, nor would you ever understand. Glember, I began, yet Glember interrupted. I let you believe it was me. Why not? Your people so readily believe such things. I did not even have to convince you. I never argued. You so readily believed that I was a monster. I shook my head. I had blamed you for it, hated you for it. I didn't put it together until we were attacked by the wizards in that cave before the shifting pass. Glember shrugged. Watching the mouth of that cave all night got me thinking. No human knows the ways of the gargle. None care. I decided then that I would drag you back here, and show you along the way what you could not otherwise believe. I wanted you to see what the Nye wizards have destroyed. I wanted to prove to myself that man could feel, that such monsters could love. You were whispering something about your father and the rain in your sleep. I remember you said, and that is how I learned to love the rain. And I think that was when I decided what I was going to do with you. As broken and weak as you were back there, I knew you had not the strength to escape. A shame, Glember said softly in thought. What? I asked. I'll never get the opportunity to thank that rising wolf for beating you senseless, he said with a grin, and I couldn't help laughing. So why did you happen by? I asked after a moment. What were you doing in mid-Meristheria? The truth is, Glember answered, I went to do battle with the wizards of Nye. Alone? I asked Glember, and he nodded. Ha! Were you out of your mind? I asked. It was they who destroyed my people. The brute fools of their infantry knew no better than to take orders. I knew where the orders came from. I'd gotten that much from the troops left behind. It was they who devised the trickery, planned the attacks, fooled the people into fighting their savage war. I went there to slay them. Yet, as I traveled, as I grew closer, I remembered that journey my father and his father took me on. I remembered who I was. I realized I'd become what they invented, the very lie they built around the gargle. I became that monster. I decided, why should I die fighting as the savage they tried to make me appear? No, I could not in the end. I turned back, you see. I would go back home. I would die there, living as my people long have. I would not change for them. I would not defile the heart of my people by making my person as evil as they. And along the way, I happened on you. I would not end my life teaching humans to hate the gargle. I would not allow the wizards of Nye justification for their crimes, Glember explained. How many races have been fooled by these tricksters? How many have been manipulated by the bitter hatred of these wizards? How many fathers have taught their sons hatred, so these wizards can continue to pit race against race? My many times great-grandfather led our people here many years ago, Glember explained. He said it was a man that freed him. I think that man's name was McCurd. Anyway, my many times great-grandfather spoke of this and reminded us that we should maintain good relations with men, and yet the bloodline of the gargle is now spent, nearly each of them falling, with the thought that men were responsible for their demise rather than the Nye. My father hated men, wanted me to hate with him, and although I could feel the justification in his words, I could not dismiss the words of my great-grandfather. I suppose none of us would have escaped the wars in the north were it not for the man that my grandfather spoke of. Yet man failed us, and we failed men. We allowed ourselves to be tricked. My father would say, a human alive is little more than 100 gargles dead, that we could spare one or the other, but not both. Yet we escaped the wars and live because of men. I knew not how to honor both my ancestors and my father, but they are gone now. They are both long gone and dispersed into the earth. There are no other gargles left to honor. Glember leaned against the stone chair. There is no one left to honor, he repeated. I sat there in quietude, unsure of how to respond. I can still hear their laughter, Glember professed. Their feet on the floorboards. He leaned his head back now. I can remember the touch, he said, staring off. He started shaking his head. But I can never feel it again, he finished. Ever. This concludes part 16 of 17 of Glember, The Tale of a Monster. You're listening to the first book of the Meristherian Trilogy. Please subscribe if you like the content, where you'll have access to additional books. Feel free to support this site by telling others about it and dropping the link on your social media sites. These books are free to listen to, as you know, and everyone's welcome here. Leave a friendly comment or question if you like, and I'll try to keep up with these as regularly as possible. Again, this is AK. Thanks for listening, friends, and I'll see you on the next and final cut of Glember, The Tale of a Monster.